Welcome to Making Sense of Complexity, featuring conversations with complexity science practitioners and philosophers. Our goal is to share insights on how to make sense of our complex and uncertain world. Today, our guest is Sam Barton, host of the Talk of Today podcast and product lead at Ideamarket, a virtual marketplace of ideas. Sam's focus is on what complexity science can contribute to questions in moral and political philosophy. Here we go. Sam, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity. Really glad to have you as a guest on the podcast. I had the opportunity to meet you last November at a Complexity Weekend session, and I was immediately excited and impressed by your particular interest in kind of the crossover between science and philosophy. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, George. Great to be here.
So I'd like to start just by asking my guests, where they're calling in from and what the weather's like.
Yeah, well, I am calling in from Sydney, Australia. I'm quite close to the beach, and the weather is, well, right now it's not raining, but it was raining quite heavily just before, and the rain has been unceasing. We have basically had torrential downpours for the past few months, and when the sun does come out, it is quite an event. So much so that my partner and I, we stop work and we go outside and sit in the sun and do work later on because we just have not seen the sun in a while. So
that sounds a little bit more like Seattle in the U.S. than it does Australia. We think of Australia as a very sunny climate, and I guess this is an indicator of some changing patterns.
Yeah, well, we've got La Nina, so I think that's the big driver here. But it is uncharacteristic of Sydney. We've had more than our year's worth of rain already.
Yeah. Well, I hope it gets a little bit better for you and you get a chance to get outside. So let's start by just giving us a little bit about your background. What drew you into complexity science as an area of interest?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a varied background, I guess. I've always been interested in science. I wanted to study science at university, but I ended up working in, you could say, tech companies, startups. But the interest of science has always been there. And I started a podcast in 2017 while I was at uni, basically to exercise my curiosity. I realized that through podcasts, you can have conversations with amazing people. And if you ask them to jump on and talk to you for 2 hours about their favorite thing, a lot of them will do so. And that was a remarkable thing for me to discover. So I would read someone's book, and it would be on anything, any scientific topic, or anything to do with science, technology, whatever. And I would get them on the show and speak to them about whatever it is they were up to. And one of my guests, I think his name was Kari I can never pronounce his last name. Kari Bamaya. He was actually he wrote one of the early books on blockchain, but he was also interested in complex systems. So I think I got my first introduction there. And a mutual friend of ours, who was also on the podcast, I think he was my first podcast interview. He's an economist, Brendan Markey-Towler. He gave me a book recommendation, and that book was The Origins of Wealth. And I think it was that book that really opened up the world of complexity to me. And what I like so much about it is that it is, I would say, the science or the mode of thinking which lends itself best to a generalist, because it incorporates so many different, there are so many components to it that make lots of problems in what you would consider to be disparate areas amenable to being solved with this toolkit. So I do think of myself as a bit of a generalist. So
yeah. Just wanted to ask you, that podcast is Talk of Today, right?
That's correct. Talk of Today.
And people can find it on podcast apps or look up the website. Is it what's the website? Is it Talk of Today?
Yeah, you can talkoftoday.com or samhbarton.com. They both go basically to the same place.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
if you're into science, tech, philosophy.
Yeah. I've listened to a couple of episodes, and they are great. Really a wide range of topics and characters, and it's interesting as well that that's one of the features I'm hearing about complexity science. I mean, you touched upon some really very disparate things, blockchain and then economics and social issues. How these things fit together is one of the reasons complexity science seems to have that very broad crossover, cross-fertilization feature to it. Do I get that right?
Yeah, definitely. And while the topics do seem disparate to me, a lot of the conversations I have are connected in ways that I see them to be connected. And I guess a part of I have like a little, the podcast I found is a way for me to try to seed a worldview in the minds of regular listeners, because I see them as all connected, and I have like it's not propaganda, but it's like, here's some really interesting stuff. Here is how I think these ideas fit together to create a picture of a world that is and that could be. And that's what I have uncovered or discovered that the podcast is.
Yeah, and that's what got me so excited, because I have that same interest in figuring out how do I don't want to digress a lot, but my sense was, coming out of the 19th and into the 20th century, there was this optimism about science having all the answers and the theory of everything and logic, and then it just all fell apart in the 20th century. And part of what's coming out of it is the issue of complexity, and how all these fields, whether you're talking physics or mathematics or biology or sociology or economics, all have some of these same features, and it's very different than what we might have thought was going to be the case 100 years ago. Yeah. So I'm very excited about it. Yeah, I'm excited about it and glad to have you. So let's start. There are two aspects that you've been working on that I find particularly interesting, and so I wanted to touch base with you on both of them. And the first is the work you're doing with a startup called Ideamarket. And maybe you could just give us a quick intro of Ideamarket and kind of what it's based on and where that enterprise hopes to get.
Yep. So Ideamarket is a literal marketplace of ideas, which we can unpack, and that is built on the Ethereum blockchain. So the Ethereum blockchain is one of the most popular crypto projects out there, and it is effectively a global computer. And the purpose of Ideamarket is to try and bring the world's attention to ideas and people that we really should be paying more attention to, because right now our attention is somewhat fractured and is not really being applied in areas, or our attention is not being directed to areas that we really should be paying attention to, like the threat of potential civilizational collapse this century or potential extinction, and we're just focusing on a whole bunch of other things. Mm-hmm. So the general purpose is to add greater signal to the noise of the cacophony that is the internet, and help people make better sense of the world by tapping into the computational capacity of the market and applying that to sense making. So
let me back up a second and just ask you, why is it important that this is based upon a blockchain technology or a crypto type technology, which it comes out of complexity science, but in terms of the complexity of mathematics and mathematical structures and setting algorithms in place that have password protection that can't be broken. So how does blockchain play into this?
Yeah, so the simplest way you can think of a blockchain is it's a massive distributed database, and something that makes it very, very important, not from like the perspective of making money, but I see blockchain, crypto, Web3, however you want to refer to it, as a incredibly important technology for the improvement of our social lives, for the improvement of, for the securing of human rights, for ensuring that people have access to basic freedoms. And one of the things about many blockchain projects is that they are permissionless, that people can access and interact with the blockchain without anyone saying that they can or cannot. And because Ideamarket is playing in the realm of information, identifying what sorts of information it is it's playing in the realm of information, but trying to empower people to identify which sources of information or which information itself is valuable. That's a very important topic today, as it has always been. Misinformation, propaganda, these things feature heavily in our lives, and perhaps we're only becoming more and more aware of it today. So blockchain is effectively necessary for this project because it is censorship resistant. You can't stop someone from participating on the network. You can't stop someone from sharing certain information.
Yeah, and that's a critical social issue of the day. We talk about that all the time, and the part of the problem is there's so much information coming at us from all sorts of different directions, and the question is, well, how do you know it's true? How do you know who to trust? And the old ways of trusting information just doesn't work anymore when there's so much of it and it's coming from all different directions. So how is Ideamarket different? In the old structure that we had filters, journalists and government officials, or experts in certain fields, and then we sort of had processes, I guess, that for them to be filtered out so we could trust the information that was coming to us. Now that seems to be gone. So how does Ideamarket address that?
Well, I'd just say, you say we could trust that information, right?
Sort of.
That we were getting from these authorities. And the authorities could be universities, governments, journalists, and we thought that we could trust them, but I think what the advent of the internet has done has made us realize that we can't actually trust these authorities as much as we first thought we could. Maybe at the grand scale of things, they might be correct in certain ways, particularly in the sciences. Like that is where, the proof is in the pudding. But when it comes to matters of governance and, just more general public, what's the word I'm looking for? Public interest matters, maybe we can't trust them as much. And I think this was made really apparent over the past decade. The internet came around in, I think it was the 80s, but it really hit its stride in the 2000s and the 2010s, really, when everyone had a mobile phone in their pockets. And with COVID in particular, we realized that the information that's being disseminated from these institutions, which we thought we could trust, might not actually be as honest or as truthful as we had anticipated. And that's not to say that they are knowingly reporting things that are false. They may be reporting things that they think are true, but we end up discovering are false. So we have realized recently that the existing sense-making apparatus, you could say, for our globally interconnected society is outdated and needs to be updated. And the reason why you could say it's like not up to the challenge at the moment is because these institutions are severely limited. They don't have that many people involved with actually making sense of the world and then disseminating that information. They lack, you could say, like from a complex systems perspective, like the computational capacity to process all of the information that's being piped in through the internet, triaging it, making sense of which information should we pay more attention to, which should we pay less attention to, and then distributing that to the rest of the world. And this doesn't sound like it doesn't sound too bad, perhaps, but I do see this as an existential issue. Organisms live and die by the information they acquire and integrate and act upon. And the same is true for societies. And at the moment, we face existential threats, the likes of which we have never seen before. And some people put the risk of us going extinct at about this century, like an existential event happening this century, at about 1 in 6. That's Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, a philosopher at the University of Oxford. Some people put that risk at even higher. Now, if you were to talk to 100 people on the street, in a developed world, in a more developed country like Australia, for instance, I would say that 99 people would have never have heard that statistic. But we are talking about the future of our civilization here. Perhaps the future of life in the cosmos, who knows? So there is obviously a huge issue with our ability to integrate information into our societies and act upon it. And unfortunately or fortunately, the ideas that animate a society are truly the difference between life and death. And I think I'm making it seem to be a way bigger problem than it actually is. But I truly believe this. So what Ideamarket seeks to do is, rather than rely upon these epistemic authorities, these severely limited authorities, by limited by the nature of their constitution, what Ideamarket seeks to do is to tap into the power, into the awareness, into the genius of the entire world, to tap into the perceptions of the people on the front lines, you could say, of a whole variety of different fields, and to empower people to go out there and say, you know what, I think this idea is important, or I think we need to pay more attention to this for XYZ reasons, and then to allow that idea to get amplified through the power of the market, by creating a marketplace of ideas where people can truly invest in, so put money towards and buy tokens for specific ideas, or their promoters, their promulgators, the people who are championing these ideas. We can align the profit motive with sense making, with having a better model of reality, with credibility.
With credibility, yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to take a quick little step back, because I had Daniel Friedman on the show, and he was talking about ant colonies, and we talked about the fact that the ants themselves don't have a huge computational capacity, but the ant colony, with the combined interactions of all of those not very smart ants, can generate a much higher level of intelligence. It's kind of out of the working of the individuals in that context of the colony, you end up with a much higher level of intelligence. So that's a little bit what you're talking about, right? Each individual, or the institutions that are coming out with the information and putting it out in the internet, how much do they know? How broad is their knowledge? Can you really rely on them to know everything? No, they can't know everything. But now, if you can create a system with Ideamarket where that becomes part of a collective computational process through the applications of the technology, the distributed technology, the fact that nobody's censoring, but people are making their choices, and then you're hoping that what emerges out of this is really a higher level of credibility and intelligence and reliable information. Do I kind of have that right?
1,000%. Yeah, the end goal is to develop a credibility layer for the internet, really. So when you're coming across information online, if you're going through Twitter or Facebook, there is an indicator on that piece of information that says, maybe not a credibility score, but there's some sort of information that can provide you with a better understanding about how much attention should you pay to that information or that source. I just to run off one of those points, I've been trying to write an essay about all this to try to capture this, and I kind of think that we live in idea communism at the moment, or we have done for a long time, where we have just a few centralized institutions responsible for the collective narrative, what everyone believes. And now I see this move towards the marketization of information. Or it's not quite that, but just by tapping into enabling these narratives to be created from the market itself through this collective computation, as the move towards capitalism. And I do think there's an analogy there, mainly from the computational capacity, from the computational perspective. Why does capitalism work? Why are people in countries that use, I don't want to say capitalism, to be honest, I'd just rather say market economies. Why do market economies perform so well? It's because they're tapping into the supercomputers between the ears of billions of people. That's why. These are little computers.
Right, and each individual decision may not be that critical, and the person making a decision may not have a lot of information. But if you add up all of those pieces of all those decisions across a free market where you have equal information among buyers and sellers, and free exchange, and then you're going to get the emergence of that higher intelligence. The whole concept of free markets from Adam Smith's Invisible Hand and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So it strikes me that I like what you said a little earlier, and I'm thinking back, who used to tell us how to make sense? Right? Well, it was the priest, and then it was the emperor, and then it was the political apparatus, and then it started to loosen up. So now we had science entering the fray, and then it became the top scientists, and we revere Nobel Prize winners and great professors, and so there's that. And then it was also media, and what you're pointing out is that with the internet and global society, whatever structure contributed to those being useful and valuable to us has been obliterated by the cacophony of information that's just overwhelming.
Yeah, and it's the amount of information that's out there, but it's also the fact that the incentives that drive a lot of these epistemic authorities are not aligned with the truth. They're not aligned with developing an accurate model of the world. I mean, advertising has always, that's the source of revenue for many of these organizations, these media organizations, and the governments. They unfortunately, from what it appears to be, they appear to be more interested in getting re-elected and maintaining some sort of status quo, or ensuring that their friends at the fossil fuel companies are happy to keep paying for their campaigns or whatever, rather than actually dealing with the reality that we are faced with, or the many realities that we are faced with. Yeah. So, it's a project that it is my favorite crypto project, and I jumped on board only after interviewing Mike, the CEO, on the podcast, because I saw they were hiring. I'm like, this is the greatest project in the entire world. I would love to help out.
So, where do we go if we're interested in finding out about it, or maybe making some picks for who we think is credible?
Yeah, go to Ideamarket.io, and it is. So you do need to jump through a few hoops because it is on crypto. It's not as easy as plugging in your credit card and getting started. It is very early days with this technology and Ideamarket, though there are plenty of tutorials that you can go through to basically start participating on the market. And it's not too complicated. But if 10 minutes, 15 minutes of your time, and if you've never bought Ethereum, or if you've never bought any cryptocurrency, I think this is a great place to start.
And this is one of the features of a complex dynamic system, is you don't necessarily know where it's going to go, and you just get this thing started, and it will evolve and advance, and perhaps at some point in the future it will actually be what you hope it is, and that is a true marketplace of ideas where people value it on the basis of how good it is, not what it's worth in dollars. Yeah, good luck.
Yeah, I mean, thank you.
Yeah, good luck. So that was exciting. I want to shift gears and talk about another project that I know you're working on, and that is kind of the ethical implications that you feel flow from some of the things you've learned in complexity science. And so explain that. How is ethics this very human concept of what's right and what's wrong? How do you see that maybe flowing out of the science of complexity?
Yeah. So I will just flag that I'm by no means an expert. I'm an amateur in everything that I do, but I have done a little bit of study in philosophy, and I was considering doing a PhD, but I might just postpone that for a while and do this on the side personally. But I will do my best to try to paint a picture of what I see to be the connection between science and morality. I do think that right and wrong, good and evil, all these words, I do think that they can be explained I do think that they can be explained in terms of what is going on in the world. And when I say, what I mean by that is stuff. Like, what is it about certain arrangements of matter that make them better than others? Like, what is it about certain actions and the impacts those actions have on the world, on stuff, that makes those actions right or wrong? So, when we think about right and wrong, we think about, murder is wrong. Why is murder wrong? Well, intuitively, we just kind of know that there's something wrong with it, right? Like, the act of killing feels barbarous, at least in most instances. If there's a war, maybe not so much. So, but that's interesting, right? So, like, the fact that there are some instances where these things are permissible, and there are some instances where they are not. So, what is it about these different circumstances? And the way I think about them is, in these two worlds, you have the world where killing is okay and the world where killing is not okay. Those two worlds are literally just collections of atoms that are arranged in a certain way, and there is something about the arrangement of those atoms that makes that action good or bad. So if that's the case, I've just been thinking, okay, well, what is it about the information associated with these instances that make it right or wrong? And I've been curious about how can we explore this question in a way that is not anthropocentric. Like, I'm interested in what is objectively morally true or morally good, and the questions of whether or not objective ethics or objective moral principles could be real aside. I don't want to get into this meta-ethical discussion. I just kind of assume that they are, but we can get into that maybe another time. So, yeah, so the question is, what is it about stuff, the way stuff is organized, and how do we do this in a way that is not anthropocentric? I can keep on running if you. I can keep talking unless you have a question.
No, I think that's good. I want to hear more.
Yeah. So it's prudent when we're dealing with these sorts of questions about what is objectively right or wrong to try to do away with our anthropocentric biases, right? Because our moral intuitions, if you take a hard, like a evolutionary or Darwinian perspective, our moral intuitions have emerged, they have evolved over the course of millions of years, and they have done so in a way that promotes our fitness. The only reason why we have moral intuitions is not because they are tracking some underlying objective moral good. All they do is ensure that we survive. And this is a bit of a problem. Like, this is actually a bit of an issue. It doesn't. If you take this perspective, you might think, all morality is associated with just ensuring our species survives, and therefore we can't make grand sweeping statements about how we feel.
Right, and that's the way people interpret Darwin as the survival of the fittest. Okay, so if survival is your thing, and fittest, most competitive, most aggressive, most this, most that, that's how you survive. Well, that doesn't sound like a very good principle to stand on when you want to say what's morally good.
No. And what's interesting is, like, we can't appeal to intuitions for a few reasons. One is that there's this evolutionary argument that kind of just knocks it down, but also that intuitions vary quite a great degree between people and cultures. So if you can't just appeal to, you can't just say intuition, because if you look across cultures, intuitions vary to dramatic degrees, and even within populations. And we know that a lot of this is genetic, that it's actually based upon the biological blueprint that dictates how we kind of are brought into this world.
That actually reminds me of a book by Nicholas Christakis. It's called Blueprint. About the physiological basis of our evolutionary process has resulted in a certain set of attributes that are positive for the social instincts of the animal, or the social suite that allows us to kind of get along and do things. And the other book that comes to mind is Jonathan Haidt's book on the righteous mind, where he says, we are different people in different cultures and different societies have a different trajectory in which they've arisen, and they will have different intuitive senses of right and wrong. And he does some analysis trying to figure out what the continuums are that people are on from a moral sense. But so you're pointing out that the intuitive base that we usually rely on for making moral judgments isn't as necessarily very reliable, so you're looking for something else.
Yeah, so what is it? Maybe if we just, rather than looking at basically yes. And what I have so rather than like looking at what people do, if we kind of just assume that life is good, perhaps we can see something that's consistent across all life forms. And there is one thing that is consistent across all life forms, and that is just the need to exist, like the need to perpetuate across time. So all living organisms, they, if we were to just bring this to physics just a little bit, we live in a world that's governed by the second law of thermodynamics. The fact that everything, like the entire universe, is tending towards a state of disorder. Now, living organisms are really thermodynamically unique or special systems, because rather than decay to disorder, they are incredibly complex, low entropy states or arrangements of matter that are able to persist across time. And all living organisms, regardless of whichever ones we're thinking of, they do this. Like, that is the process of living. The process of living is, at least ensuring that there is systemic continuity across time, so that the living organism can go and do stuff and procreate, right?
Yeah, I want to back up for a second and bring in an analogy here, and that is that entropy and the fact that the universe is running down, that's what the physicists tell us, the second law of thermodynamics, is like a river, going downstream. So it's pulling everything down, everything is, entropy is increasing and disorder is increasing, and, so everything is moving in that direction. Life is like the fish that are swimming upstream, because they're subject to entropy and they get old and they decay and all that stuff, but they are also building systems and structures and complexity and bringing energy in and using that energy to thrive and to grow and to procreate. That's all going against the stream of entropy. So it's like all of this life is going upstream.
Yeah, and there's, as we've seen over the past, billion years or so, however long life has been on Earth, that the living organisms tend to be getting more and more complex. So the entropy seems to be getting lower and lower. So if we were to bring this, so all living organisms try to, or what they do is minimize entropy locally so that they can continue across time. Like, to put it in a very, very simple snapshot.
And they do that. I know there's a concept of dissipative adaptation. In other words, they sort of export entropy to the world around them by organizing the flow of energy or the flow of information to their own benefit.
Yeah. So like the net effect is always a net increase in entropy in the universe. But so living organisms, they take energy in, process it, maintain their low entropy state, and export the entropy externally, which also has implications for things like climate change and how we perpetuate life on Earth itself. But we don't need to get into that right now. So that, by the way, is one of the fundamental features, to my mind, of complex dynamic systems that seem to self-organize and be efficient, be stable structures that are efficiently managing this flow, whatever it is, information or energy or turbulence. They're managing that flow and essentially going upstream against it, getting more complex, getting more diverse, getting better at collecting information, getting better at processing information. So this is all the stuff that life does, right? Well, and just to touch on that, this ties back into what we were speaking about with Ideamarket, right? The ability to sense and process and act upon information is critical for all living organisms do it. All living organisms are these informational, or that they are engaging in a form of computation. And, you could think of one of the limiting factors for the survival of a species is the amount of information it can process and act upon. Because as you go up in increasing levels of complexity or in scale, there's more and more information to process. There's more and more problems to come across. So, like, an increase in computation is actually necessary to deal with the new problems that we encounter at new levels of scale. So, it might be absolutely necessary that we have artificial intelligence. We have general artificial intelligence, because the amount of information that we are dealing with at this global technologically empowered scale that we find ourselves in, we will probably need these forms of AI to go there. But I digress.
Take it back to the example of little creatures, bacteria or even, the humans in the Paleolithic jungle. You'd better do your computation right, get the right answer about what that noise was or what that impulse is, because if you get it wrong, you're dead.
Yeah.
So the idea about becoming better at computing and getting better at it is that if you do it wrong, you're potentially going to make mistakes. And you point out in the Ideamarket conversation that our civilization is there. We're making some bad mistakes that are heading in the wrong direction. We're not making the right kind of computational decisions collectively. So Ideamarket is a way to try and change that and make those decisions. So now let's get back to good.
Yeah, get the nature of the good. So all organisms are engaged in this dance, this activity of, they're all engaged in making sure that entropy themselves, because they are ordered systems, they're trying to minimize their local entropy so that they continue to survive and do all this sort of stuff. And if we think of life as good in general, and all organisms are engaged in this sort of activity, then we might be able to say that low entropy systems, or that the presence of low entropy may be an indicator of the good, because if we return back to our intuitions, I know they're hard to, we might not be able to trust them as much, but they do corroborate this perspective. So how if the more senses you look at something with, the more you can believe it's real. If you see an elephant and you touch an elephant, and then if it sounds like an elephant, if it smells like an elephant, if you have all these things that are corroborating the perspective that this elephant exists, you're more likely to believe it. So if we look to our intuitions about low entropy systems and whether or not we think that lower entropy systems are more valuable, ethically valuable, that seems to be the case. So the more intelligent a species is, or the bigger a species is, like an elephant or a dolphin or a whale, we think of those as ethical being. We think of those as living organisms which have such a high level of ethical value that killing them is an atrocious thing to do. That people will protest against whaling or against the killing of elephants, whatever. They don't care so much about mice. We are happy to run all of these experiments on mice for the betterment of our civilization, right? Mice don't matter so much. Cockroaches or insects, we buy things from the grocery store which we use to exterminate these creatures because they annoy us. So that we do have this intuitive feeling about these different levels of. Yeah. So one thing I just want to highlight, that each of the entropy level of each of these organisms is different. Like an insect has a higher entropy or is less ordered than an elephant, which is probably less ordered than a whale or a dolphin.
Well, that's interesting, and it's also the case that our attitudes about some of those creatures, like insects, has been changing. Bees, for example, the crisis of bees and colony collapse, I guess is what it's called, potentially because of environmental contaminants, now threatens the ecosystem related to the pollinators that rely on pollinators in the plant community, and that's the food that we eat. And so now our survival is threatened by practices that threaten the bees. So there seems to be a lot more attention being paid to things like bees and bee colonies. These are insects that maybe in the past were viewed as less valuable, but their integrated nature in the ecosystem and the the intelligence that's built into the hive structures is now something that we're paying a little bit more attention to.
Yeah,
So,
and like
yeah.
we could say, they're valuable because you could say their value is instrumental because it, it relates to our survival. I don't know how I feel about that distinction between instrumental and
well, we can talk about
intrinsic.
we could talk about that someday, but I want to
Yeah,
that's important.
I do wanna,
That's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to touch on this point because I don't think it's as simple as a low entropy system is ethical. I don't think it's that simple at all because of the fact that our entire world is inherently relational. These things do not exist in isolation. Ecosystems are they are just. We think of the food web. They are just there are more connections between things than we even know of. So to say that something is valuable because it has low entropy, that's not really the case, because of the way the systems interact. Though you could say there may be a correlation or something between the ethical valuableness of a system and its entropy. But I'm talking a grand system. So perhaps the Earth itself, Gaia, for instance. Yeah. Perhaps that's the appropriate scale of resolution to look at this from.
The problem with looking at things instrumentally is that that's a very limited focus. What's in it for me? But that is part of a system. The system of insects is connected to the system of the ecology. The system of the ecology is connected to the system of plant production. Plant production feeds, the world, not just humans, but the rest of the world as well. And so if you start thinking about those endless connections, those network connections across this whole creative enterprise of life and the earth and the universe, now you can't look at anything just instrumentally because everything's connected to everything else.
Yeah, it's
right, so back to
the hippies were right. The hippies were right.
The hippies are right. Back to the value, the ethical consideration that comes out of this finding that lower entropy systems, more advanced, more complex, more interconnected, more highly computationally oriented, more capacity. So let's see if you can draw us into that ethical concept.
Yeah, well, we think about. So one of the dominant perspectives, at least in I'm an effective altruist, you could say, and if the general idea being that we want to do good in the world and we have limited resources, so how do we do as much good as possible? It's quite an inherently utilitarian perspective, right? And the idea is that we should be maximizing the well-being of sentient beings. And I think that's great. I really do. But I do see that the experience of sentient beings, the experience of animals, of organisms, of organisms like us or like chimpanzees and all that, is dependent upon our capacity to extract energy from the environment, to process it, to take information in, to process it, and act in certain ways. And I don't know quite how to put a bow on this because it's still something I'm kind of exploring. And I don't think I'm not the only person exploring this. I don't think these are ideas. I don't think I have a grand theory of everything or anything like that. I don't see enough people talking about questions of right and wrong, about stuff in the world, about linking it to physics. And I think we need to have more of a conversation about that because I truly believe, I just want to get this point out there. I do believe that this is how we can bridge religion and science. I see religion as stories that explain how we can engage in this ongoing entropy minimization process. Because when everyone's that's one point that we didn't really speak on. The reason why we have all our societies, the rules that we follow, the actions that we deem to be right and wrong. So stealing is wrong, murdering is wrong, adultery is wrong. These things vary sometimes between cultures, but the net effect is the preservation of local order in the society. So it's the actions that could lead to actions that could destabilize a society and result in disorder, chaos, murder, war, whatever. Those things are generally seen to be unethical, and actions that preserve and promote the generation that preserve and generate order, local order, they are good.
Yeah.
So there is this direct mapping between, you know,
Yeah.
low entropy.
If it's generational and positive and thriving, it's contributing to lower entropy. If it's aggressive or destructive or it's actually increasing entropy, and that's counter to the long run goal of better survival, more survival, and that's because that's what living systems are compelled to do. I did want to go back to one thing about moral intuition, because a lot of things that are built into the human being are really shortcuts, computational shortcuts, because there's so much information that's available to each of us, perceptual information, and too much to really process everything all the time. So from a neurological perspective, we have to develop these shortcuts or heuristics to make better choices or make the right choices for our survival, for the survival of our mates, for the survival of our species, the survival of life. So those heuristics then come out of a set of experiences where we take these shortcuts. So we might not be able to explain exactly, but this is the way we feel about something. And I'm wondering if one avenue might be to look at what those heuristics are actually pushing for. I think you said that you think these heuristics about moral intuition are actually pointing to low entropy systems as better. And now, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, we didn't have the science to start looking at. We didn't even know what entropy was and all that sort of stuff. That's all modern science. So now we can use some tools of modern science and start looking at, all right, well, what is modern science saying about low entropy systems and thriving systems and increasing computational capacity, and does that map? How does that map onto the heuristics that humans have had? So, I'll play a little role here and say, okay, if you look at the Buddhist tradition of karma, the concept of karma, and not injuring life, because that's bad karma, and you'll pay, through your many subsequent lives. And then you look at the Christian principle of love the neighbor as yourself. So that's a principle based around love. And so perhaps that's a heuristic for what the science of complexity can actually tell us of how we all get to a better place.
Yeah, it's so exciting, to be honest, to see that the things that we think of as innately human or that are in the spiritual realm in a way, to be coming together with science. Like, I see science as a spiritual enterprise, to be honest. It's about understanding the nature of reality and our place in it, and to see these things, or to at least get a glimpse of how these things can come together. And I do think that this could be the basis of a new religion, one that we actually might need, because we need to have a religion that is in accordance with the science, or we might just self-terminate, and that's not going to be too much fun. The world, the universe we're just at the beginning of this bad boy, and we want to see how this unfolds.
Yeah, and this gets to something that I've talked about sometimes, and that is, there's the concept of consilience, where the different branches of science jump together. That's E.O. Wilson's, what that term means is the jumping together of different forms of knowledge, and complexity science is really at the heart of that. Disparate areas of science sort of jumping together with new techniques and new methods and new knowledge, and all of a sudden it fits, where what's happening in physics and what's happening in markets, economics, it's telling the same story. Complexity crosses those boundaries, and
I've actually about a week ago I snagged consilience.substack.com because I'm thinking about writing just like a short little some essays just bundled under this, like in this general field of in this general area, and think about getting other people to contribute and all that, because I think it could be a bit of fun.
And that's the grander consilience. The bigger one is not just the branches of science, but science and religion, and science and ethics, and science and meaning and purpose. If those can jump together, then you have a coherent whole, and you can live a coherent life.
Yeah. Do you know who I think you should get on the show? I know, you should definitely keep this in. John Vervaeke. I think you should reach out to John Vervaeke if you're not familiar with his work.
I know I am familiar with John's work. Yeah. And he's struggling with how do you create a religion that works. It's a big, and Alain de Botton is the same thing. He's a secularist, and he started the school of life because he sees, somehow we got to get a philosophy embedded in people, the way people, because right now, each of us is kind of disintegrated into multiple different worlds. It doesn't really make sense, and then culture as a whole doesn't either. So we need that consilient philosophy to pull it together.
Just to weave this back into everything we've kind of just said, it's one of the big. It all comes down to it all comes down to memes, and I don't mean memes in the internet sense, funny picture, but memes in the Dawkins sense. The ideas that animate us and our cultures are the most important things. And what we're talking about, these religions or these philosophies, they are memes or memeplexes. They're just it's information that is living, that's thriving. And we are, in a way, agents. We are their agents. We are the warriors, or unfortunately, for better or for worse, the memes control us. We don't control them.
Oh, that's a good example, because you were just using a meme about sort of aggressive control, or in a way that is contrary to what this process is trying to achieve.
Yeah.
It's not about competition. It's about collaboration. How do we do that?
Yeah. And it's more efficient. That's the great. It all aligns. It's just it's beautiful. That's a great thing. Doing good is, all the good. Everything that is good aligns and is I don't know how to quite say this, but the good can never be bad, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Oh, that's interesting. I did have a conversation with Daniel Sanderson on the show earlier. I think it might be just the episode before, where he talked as well about each of us is in a trajectory of past, present, and future, and so we respond differently to different ideas and different memes because of the background that we have. And so, the question of narrative is how you construct a narrative, a set of ideas that can broadly appeal to people who are coming from widely different trajectories. Now, somehow the Buddha succeeded in doing that in some ways. Jesus was successful in doing that in some ways. And so even by looking at the history of those traditions, we can start thinking about, well, what does it mean to bring together now a consilience and understanding of science and philosophy and faith, and pull it into something that everybody will resonate with everybody. Tough thing.
Yeah, well, I know that in the New Bible, whatever it looks like, there will not be an equation at the top of the page, Maybe there'll be the appendices, and theology will become the study of, it'll be complexity science and all these other things coming together. So there'll be layers, like onions. There's this very superficial layer that you teach your 4-year-old, and then you get to the 8-year-old level, and then, you can do you're a scientist. At the end of the day, it's just being a spiritual scientist. And even though it's got baggage, I think that's what it is.
Well, that's great. And I want to just change the conversation a little bit to ask you some questions about your own history, how your trajectory, how you got here. Did you grow up in a religious tradition of some sort?
No, I was born Catholic. So I grew up all over the place. I was born in Australia and lived in Singapore, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. And even though I'm Australian, I only spent about 4 or 5 years in Australia between the ages of 0 and 19. And I went to a Catholic school in Australia when I was about from years 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I would have been from the age of 5 to 8. and I never really got in. I went to church every now and again. I did my first communion, which is one of the. I don't really know much about it at all, but I know that I didn't really buy into it, and yeah, I just never really got into it. I have prayed once or twice, but that was only when I was really worried about something. I'm like, look, big man upstairs, if you are real, like I'm going to pray to you now, just in case.
Well, that's Pascal's wager. You know, you don't lose anything by praying, so you might gain something. But that sounds like a very varied background. Did you have exposure in your travels to other cultures, other religions? You know, sort of. How did you get? How did you make sense of what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, so majority of my time was spent in Malaysia from when I was about 8 to 19. And Malaysia is a wonderful country, and it's incredibly multicultural. More multicultural than Australia is supposedly one of the famous success stories of multiculturalism, and I don't think that's the case. I think Australia is far less multicultural than Malaysia. In Malaysia, you've got three main populations. There's the Chinese population, there's the Malay population, and then there's the Indian population. And there are different cultural events associated with each of the cultures, right? You've got Chinese New Year, with the Malays you've got Ramadan, Indians Deepavali, and because of the Western influence, you can just sprinkle in a bit of Christmas as well, Easter and Christmas. So when I was there, I would experience, I would go to my friend's house for Chinese New Year and spend sometimes a week with him, just going to open houses, and which is kind of a thing you do there, and having dinner and listening to the firecrackers, watching the lion dances. And same for Ramadan or Hari Raya with my Malay friends. And we'd learn about. I didn't really have as many Indian friends. Didn't really engage too much in the Indian cultural things. But the school I went to was an international school, and we learned about all of these things. And we would get holidays all the time, and we'd learn about what people were celebrating. So I think that that upbringing, and just seeing from a very young age that there is a plurality of ways in which you can approach life, that you can see life, and that the school that I went to was one of, there were 65 nationalities represented, and people of all colors, like all the colors under the sun, and religions and all that. And when you're in a place where everyone's different, everyone becomes the same. And that was my upbringing was varied cultural backgrounds, varied national backgrounds, and just the overall humanness of each other, I think, was something that really stood out to me. And I think I've always thought of myself, when you start asking these questions, I don't know when you start asking yourself these questions, but when I did start thinking about where I was from, I was thinking, well, I'm more of a global citizen than anything. And I think that with the internet, a lot more people are starting to think this way. I think the internet, when you open up your phone, you can see people from all sorts of backgrounds doing the same thing, eating delicious food, laughing at the same inane jokes.
A lot the same. A lot the same.
Yeah. We just get hung up on the differences because we habituate to the similarities, right?
Yeah, and there may be another dimension to that, is that the more you start thinking about existential questions and global issues, the less important those boundaries may seem, right? Because this affects all of us, no matter where we are, no matter what our nation or what our culture. They're all affecting all of us.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we need to. Something we need to get past, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to finish with this last question here. Broad experience, a lot of different factors. Do you have a time or an experience that really moved you, really had an impact? Sometimes people have things that they feel were sort of transcendent or just unexplained, and it just kind of happened, and it really, really made a difference.
So there's three that spring to mind, that are very different. There's one moment I always remember, and it was the first thing that popped up in my mind when you said this, and it was when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I asked my dad a question, and he said, "I don't know." And the fact that my dad didn't know something, and the fact that there were questions unanswered, at least from that perspective, just completely blew my mind. And that moment's always stuck with me. So I would say that. on the more spiritual side of things, nothing so much when I've been sober, but I have experimented with psychedelic substances, and one substance in particular, DMT, made me firstly obsessed with information in like the physical sense, and led to like a lot of this, made me go back to university and study philosophy. So DMT is the psychedelic substance that's found all throughout nature, and you can eat it or you can drink it in the form of ayahuasca or various shamanic brews, or you can smoke it. And I smoked it, and you feel like you go to a different place, and the experience of wherever you go, like it feels like the most familiar place you've ever been in your entire life. It feels like home with a capital H. And you feel, I saw this entity or this thing that was, it was like a grand consciousness. It was like, imagine I'm a drop in the ocean, and that thing was the ocean. And I got an overwhelming sense of there being information there. Like it was this intelligence, but like the word information stood out to me. And I cannot square this with my materialistic perspective of the world at all. Like none whatsoever. But I feel it to be true. And because there was this feeling of familiarity that was just unreal. And I feel like that was a place I was before I was born. So that really stood out to me. And I'm trying to, I think the science, I think the science will square with this at some point in the future. Yeah. I just cannot do that now. Yeah. So that was the other big spiritual experience I've had, I would say.
Well, that's fascinating. I had one of my own that's somewhat similar, and for me, what was important, it was just that sense of feeling connected to everything. Yeah, everything was connected, and I was quoted by a friend as repeating several times or repeatedly, "Everything is everything," which didn't contain a whole lot of content, but it did capture the feeling of being connected. So those can be very, very powerful experiences, hard to explain, and one way, actually, I think it might be from a guest I have coming up from in the future that talked about that as a way in which the constructs of our own human brain, which are ordered and structured and hierarchical and and networked and all that stuff, just sort of loosen to the point where you just sense that connection. You feel that connection because you don't have the barriers in your own brain. So maybe that's a way of kind of putting an explanation around it.
I did an interview with a guy called Adam Saffron, who's at Johns Hopkins doing psychedelics research. He's done a bit on psychedelics, and I think that squares with his perspective. He's he speaks about this at very high level, so I do my best to follow. But it does seem like these substances break down patterns and allow you to see more like the raw informational input, and to change the way you perceive. So breaks down your perceptual filters so that you see things in new ways and in ways that you've never seen them before. And then you can build new patterns from there. So you can break down old habits and build new habits. Normal habits, like, whatever it be, if you're smoking or whatever, but also cognitive habits, like the way you see things.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the many of the indigenous cultures that did not have access to the tools and technologies of modern science to try and make sense of things did use those technologies to try and get access to some higher levels of information. It's pretty interesting.
Well, it's funny that it looks like the early Christians did as well. So psychedelics are a religious thing. Yeah, religions without psychedelics are unusual, like historically anomalous. Yeah, you could say.
And there are other ways of getting there. If you think about the asceticism of some Buddhist traditions, or the meditation as a pathway to that sense of oneness. Different traditions have different ways of trying to get to that same place. So that's interesting.
Actually, I did have one more experience that brings up, and it was from meditation. I remember I've been meditating regularly in the mornings, and one day I meditated. I went down to I was in the US on a little trip. I had meditated. I went down to Starbucks. I had a coffee, and I was reading a book, and the sentence, it was one of Joseph Campbell's books. I can't remember which one. And I read a sentence in that. And the sentence reduced me to tears and unlocked something in me. And then for the rest of the day, I was walking around ecstatic, just on top of the world. I had never felt this way before. And I think this is how monks feel all the time. Like, I'm pretty sure I achieved monk mode temporarily for, for about 4 or 5 hours. I have no idea what happened. But that was a big spiritual experience for me. It was bizarre.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. That's really, really cool. Sam, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for just a great conversation.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. Next episode, I'll be joined by Gary F. Bengier, a writer, philosopher, and technologist, the author of the award-winning SF novel Unfettered Journey, and a board member with the Santa Fe Institute. In the meantime, please explore the websites of our collaborators, Complexity Weekend, Planksip, and Talk of Today, and join the conversation on our social media outlets or on spiralinquiry.org. Stay well and have a great week.